Hey everybody, so I'm here today to talk to you about persuasion and its use in magic. So basically, every magician, every time will always get asked, how did you do it? How's the trick done? I'm not here to explain how to do magic tricks, but I will say that persuasion is key in all aspects of magic. So that means whether it's a modern magician on stage doing a show, or the classical meaning of magician like the ancient magi and talking about metaphysics, but they're very different kinds of persuasion. So for example, if I asked you to pick a card, you'd probably pick a card. But if I want you to pick a specific card, or I want you to choose a specific colour, I need to persuade you. Now most of you probably didn't think of the colour blue just there, because that's not what the video is about, but also me saying blue instead of you isn't particularly subtle. Now it might slip by some people and it might work, great, but it's not specific, it's not particularly subtle. And humans are complex beings and we don't like to feel manipulated, so we need to persuade on a more subtle level. So there's different kinds of persuasion. There's spoken persuasion, where I want you to believe a thing or think a thing, and I'll implant little suggestions maybe in my speech. That's spoken suggestion or spoken persuasion. But then when we talk about metaphysics, we're talking about like lighting a candle from across a room, or turning a person into a newt. So that's quite difficult to do. Because, well, first it's a more difficult thing to do anyway. But also the person into the newt example, I'm not saying, hey Steve, you should be a newt, and Steve says, oh yeah, okay, that sounds like a good idea. I'm trying to communicate with the physical makeup of Steve, and have those bits, I suppose, reform into a newt, which is hard to do because, again, people are very complex beings. But what if I were to do something with, for example, something easier, simpler, a piece of paper? So, when I first thought about doing this lecture, I remembered a film called Solid Geometry. It was a short film that came out, I think actually in 2002, which I was surprised to learn. I thought it was a bit older than that. But it stars Ewan McGregor as a guy called Phil. I did actually want to re-watch that film in preparation for this lecture, but I can't find it anywhere online, which was disappointing, because it's quite good. But anyway, so in the film, Phil inherits the secret diaries of his great-great-grandfather. Now, I can't honestly remember if his great-great-grandfather was meant to be a scientist or a magician, but science and magic rather, they're two sides of the same coin, as long as you're, dealing with the right currency. But anyway, so this great-great-grand Phil was obsessed with the idea of a plane without a face, in the geometric terms, rather than like an unfinished character from Thomas the Tank Engine. So he's obsessed with a plane without a face, and all his colleagues say, you're crazy, that's not a thing that's possible. And as we currently understand maths and physics, it's not. So Phil's reading these diaries like a book. He's going through all his old research, and he becomes obsessed. It actually leads to the breakdown of his marriage, I believe, which is a little bit sad. Oh, this paper wasn't perfectly squared to begin with, unfortunately, so it might tear. But yeah, Phil becomes obsessed reading all this stuff. And it flashes back, I think, to the great-great-grandfather discovering things that as Phil's discovering them himself as well. It's good. So, at one stage, Phil says, hey, this is interesting. And he takes a big piece of paper because he's found instructions in these diaries. So he takes this paper and he starts folding it. He creates this flower, like an orchid. And that orchid, as he folds it and folds and folds it, that orchid folds in on itself and it disappears. Now, as a kid, I had a phase, I suppose. I was really into origami for a while as a child. One of my, I think she was actually a substitute teacher, but one of my primary school teachers was doing art with us one day and she introduced us to origami. And I thought this was really cool. And so my parents got me a book on it and I started to learn it. I think it was around the same time as, you know, the dinosaur phase that everybody seems to go through. So I thought this was cool and I started to learn origami. Now, I say this because I want you to realize that I was never amazing at it. I haven't done it in a long, long time. But also I never learned how to do an orchid like Phil does. But also talking about persuasion, it's much if you already want to eat a chocolate bar, it's easier for me to persuade you to do it. If you say, no, I really shouldn't, I'll be sick if I eat a chocolate bar, or I'm trying to lose weight, whatever. If you're adamant about not doing it, then it'll take a bit of persuasion. But if you already kind of want it, but you're like, oh, I shouldn't, you know, I don't want to be bad, then yeah, it's going to be a lot easier for me to say, sure, go on. So it's easier to convince or persuade people to do things they already want to do. It's easier to persuade objects or living things, I suppose, to do things that are already in their nature. So, I never learned to do an orchid. But also, now I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I've never seen an orchid disappear into another dimension. So I don't think I could persuade one to do that. But I'm not making an orchid. I am making a bird. So, I'm trying to make a bird. So the idea being, if it's easier to persuade things to do things that are already in its nature, also I quite like the use of origami to explain this theory, because literally as you're persuading something, you're bending it to your will, right? So every fold is a bend in the paper, so you're physically, literally bending it to your will. But as I said, it's easier to persuade things to do things if it's already in their nature. I don't think I could persuade an orchid to disappear. But what we have here is not great, I'll admit. I have here a traditional Japanese origami crane. So, rather than trying to convince an orchid to disappear, I'm going to try to convince a bird to fly. To demonstrate magic. We've taken a piece of paper and we bend it to our will. It's now a bird for all intents and purposes. And if we can persuade it on a metaphysical level that it is a bird, we should be able to persuade it to fly. that, still have to concentrate. So I don't know how long we'll get, but that shows persuasion. As the science bit here says beside me, persuasion, the effect of magic, is the new metaphysical state. What is it? The new metaphysical state of a subject as a function of the change of persuasion on its original state. I took a piece of paper, the original state, and I persuaded it was a bird. And as a bird, it's in its nature to fly. I hope you enjoyed that. See you next time.